Presidential Wealth Management. Federal employees, learn the top 4 mistakes to avoid and COVID's impact on your federal retirement plan.
The U.S. government is the largest employer in the world. Altogether, the U.S. government and its various departments employ over 9 million people. That's 6% of the workforce of the United States. Of that 9 million, over 2 million are direct full-time federal employees. In Colorado, there are over 53,000 full-time federal employees. And if you're one of them, this Eagle's Nest webcast is for you as we look at the top 4 mistakes made in the federal retirement plan and the impacts of the COVID-19 virus on federal retirement plans. With us today, Presidential Advisor Kelly St. George. Kelly is a master's degreed plain talker who enjoys working with non-traditional families and federal employees as well. Kelly, we'll go more into detail with this later on, but give us the short version of why it's so important for federal workers to work with an advisor that they know and they trust.
Yes, I agree, Keith. There's the reason you'd want to work with an advisor that has experience in understanding the federal employee benefits is so that you don't have holes in your retirement that you find out later down the road you couldn't recover from. This is critical, and there are often webinars and seminars offered for a couple of days, but we can really do an individual sit-down situation where we can find out what those exceptions are for you personally.
Things you can't recover from. Those are things, it gets too late in life to let those get in the way of a happy retirement. We will go into more detail with that. Bruce Larsen is a certified financial planner, a senior advisor in our presidential team, and author of A Concise Guide to Taxes in Retirement. In addition to all of that, Bruce is the firm's human thesaurus. And there is no place where it's more needed than in the instructions on how to successfully navigate your way through the federal retirement program. Bruce, give us the short version of whether or not most people on their own can successfully do just that. Do they end up retiring without having any idea what many of these terms mean?
Yeah, I think we see quite a bit of that. And frankly, I see more of it from people that have gone to a 1 or a 2 day workshop, because their head gets filled with every exception possible in that retirement system, as Kelly mentioned, to where their head is just spinning and they don't really know where they're at. And then they go home and they try to remember what applies to them. They try to put it together on a spreadsheet or something like that. And a lot of times they just give up and they just say, I don't even know where I'm going with this stuff. Well, we use very sophisticated software that we can plug all those variables in, put inflation adjustments in, you name it, put various assumptions on where taxes are going to go. And then we can say, okay, here's really what things look like for you. You get a very clear picture.
Versus trying to figure it out yourself, versus making guesses.
Yes, exactly. And by the way, I have to correct you. I'm not a certified financial planner. I'm a certified estate planner. I think that's what you were referring to, as well as a National Social Security advisor. But I want to throw that out there when I don't have the designation.
Thank you very much. Thank you. On the side of your screen, you'll find a box that says chat. Click on it and send us your questions, and we'll do our best to get to them during the webcast. We also invite you to go to presidentialwm.com, click on Contact, and ask us to email you the printed version of this webcast, the top 4 mistakes to avoid and COVID's impact on federal retirement. Bruce, let's go to you. And let's start with one of the probably most misunderstood functions of this whole process of retiring from the federal government. Shoot.
Yeah, a lot of people get wrapped around the axle when they hear about the government pension offset and the windfall elimination provision. What those are is they have to do with how your Social Security benefits are affected by having a federal pension or a federal annuity, however you want to refer to it. We typically refer to it as a pension. Well, you have to understand that only applies to people under the old CSRS system. It has nothing to do with FERS. It has nothing to do with career military. Okay. And only now about 4% of the federal workforce are under the old CSRS system. So those are the only people that have to be aware of that. Now, for those few people, I do want to just touch on what it actually is so that they know what it is. The government pension offset, that refers to receiving spousal or survivor Social Security benefits from your spouse if you are a CSRS employee. And essentially what's going to happen is it's probably going to eliminate it, because typically a spousal benefit you receive when your spouse passes away, you get that full Social Security benefit.
Right.
Government pension offset reduces that by 2/3 whatever your federal pension is. So if your federal pension is $3,000 a month and that survivor benefit is $2,000 a month, it's gone. Okay, because 2/3 of your pension is $2,000. Now the windfall elimination provision, that refers to your own Social Security benefit. So let's say that you work part of your career in Social Security covered earnings and then part of it under CSRS. It's going to reduce your Social Security benefit by up to about $480. And it depends on how many years of Social Security covered earnings you had. If you had 30 years of Social Security covered earnings, there's no reduction at all. And we have a very slick little calculator. We can immediately plug your numbers in and tell you exactly where you stand with that. But again, if you're FERS, which that's 96% of federal employees, or career military, you fully participate in the Social Security system, so it has no effect on your benefits at all. And it's about half of the FERS people I sit down with say, you know, I don't know where Social Security is going to be with this GPO and WEP. Well, that's a throwback from the old system. So most people don't have to worry about it. And by the way, I will throw something in with CSRS. There's a thing called a voluntary contribution plan that you probably heard about at one point and have forgotten about. If you're getting ready to retire from CSRS, you've got to talk to us about that, because essentially you can take your taxable investments and turn those into a Roth IRA in one fell swoop just as you retire. So that can be a huge tax savings for those people. So I just throw that out there as something that we always look at. We always look at everything. And that is really one of the biggest opportunities for CSRS people, not available to FERS.
With regard to the government pension offset and the WEP, more the government pension offset, almost without, well, no, there are some exceptions, but most of the people that I deal with that are federal employees, FERS, and a few CSRS, but even Social Security people, just in general. Many of them have worked, they've talked to coworkers for years, they've worked up to their retirement time, and yet they still feel that the government pension offset is stealing money from them, is taking money that they worked for away from them in retirement, and they have no recourse against it.
Well, they actually do have a very good recourse. And that is that it doesn't work both ways. So the government pension offset will reduce your Social Security survivor benefit. But if you're the CSRS employee and you pass away first, your survivor pension goes to your spouse with no reduction, and they keep their full Social Security. So obviously the way to eliminate it is just pass away first. Sorry.
Yeah, that's one way. That's one way, isn't it? You know, and I usually take those people and I say, let's focus on what you have instead of what you perceive as being taken away from you.
Right.
And even with the government pension offset, with the 1/3 you're keeping, try to think of it as gas for your car all month, or try to think of it as your public service bill.
Typically, you're not keeping that 1/3, because if you're if that Social Security survivor benefit is 2/3 or less than what your pension is, you'll get none.
Right, right.
So it's just something you have to be aware of. Like everything else, just go into it with your eyes wide open.
And once again, I go back to Kelly, something that you said. Yes, it makes all the sense in the world to go into this educated with an advisor that you can trust, with somebody that you've gotten to know, that you've worked with for a while, that you've asked all the questions, you've got all the answers, and somebody who you're assured that your decisions are being made in your best interest. And I don't want to put anything or anybody down, but just going into this without that kind of counsel, it makes no sense, because even for us, this thing is very, very complicated, which goes to your point, which goes to the second mistake, the second most made mistake, is that just doing this without a plan.
That's right. That's right.
That's huge.
So Keith, when people are putting a plan together, oftentimes they haven't really thought through, well, what are my expenses and my housing going to look like down the road? What are my big purchase items going to be? How is inflation going to impact this? One of the things that we do when we're doing an in-depth planning process with someone is we are actually looking at what are those future expenses. Are they going to look the same as today? There are some people that actually spend more in retirement than they do while they're in their working years. Now you have a whole bunch of Saturdays and Sundays, right? But it just depends on the individual. So, people can throw out numbers and say, well, you should plan for 80% of your gross income, because you're now not going to be having to pay FICA and Social Security. But the problem is that doesn't take into account lifestyle, right? Mm-hmm. It doesn't take into account potentially maybe in your family, or like me, where you've got an elderly parent that might need some assistance. Maybe you have some upcoming costs from a senior parent, or, as we've seen a lot in this decade, is children coming back home who really aren't able to fend for themselves. So really sitting down and getting an understanding of what your personal family looks like. What are your concerns going forward? What are your expenses? Do you want to just go fishing and write a book when you retire? Or are you planning to cruise the world and take all of the travel that you haven't had time for? So each individual has a different story. And when you meet with somebody to actually start a plan, it's really important to not just look at what your budget expenses are today, but what are they going to look like tomorrow? And also just running through having the plan updated regularly. I think that's probably the biggest thing I see, is that people who put a plan together and they set it and forget it. They don't come back in and get it, or even get a second opinion if you've had a plan done and maybe you'd like to have somebody else look at it again. That's another good thing. So I encourage people to utilize a professional advisor like we have here at Presidential to understand what their life goals are, really dial down. It's interesting when you start getting into the nitty-gritty of family dynamics, and I think that's such a key piece to the planning process, and something that I don't see a lot of people do.
And I want to go to Bruce on this topic too, but first, Kelly, healthcare is something that, my gosh, with inflation, we put inflation usually at the better part of 3% going into a retirement income plan. But healthcare costs, if we're going to be as accurate as we can, well, I think we're still underestimating right now. We have healthcare costs rising at 5% or more. Mm-hmm. And that's something, boy, ignore that one and you're going to end up in trouble, aren't you?
Yes, you are. So under the federal employee health benefits, which is basically the health insurance for federal employees, the rules say that a federal employee has to retire with an immediate annuity that begins within 30 days of retirement, or they have to have a postponed annuity under the FRA, or full retirement age plus 10. And if they elect at that time for just themselves, they may be cutting off their family from future eligibility of health insurance. which is a really key decision. So making sure that you've considered whether you've included your family, so that something doesn't happen in case of your death. There is also, though, an additional caveat is that you have to be enrolled for about 5 years, or your earliest opportunity to enroll before you retire. Now, it's okay if you've changed plans during those 5 years. You can change plans every year, but you do need to be enrolled for 5 years before you can be considered for continuation of coverage. And one of the things that people should also consider, this is a big deal, is maybe not just only looking at the federal employee health benefits and saying, okay, well, that's going to be the plan. This is where we're going to go. Medicare may be a cheaper option, so it might be a good idea to check into Medicare costs, and especially if the family's in good health. In that case, what you would do is you would not cancel your benefits. You would suspend them. So that way, if you need health benefits down the road, that would be the biggest piece of advice that I have in regards to maintaining health benefits in the future. But as you said, Keith, I utilize 7% inflation on my health costs.
7% on healthcare. Wow.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. Bruce,
I just want to throw something in there. You'd think that, well, gosh, nobody's going to go into retirement without being fully covered under their healthcare plan. But here's where you have issues, is typically you have, in today's world, both spouses typically work, right? Well, if you have one spouse working for the federal government, they're under FEHB, and another spouse is in the private sector and they have their own health care coverage, then that's probably how they're operating. It doesn't really make sense to, because typically for the employee, healthcare is very expensive. It's just when you add family members that you have to start paying more. So they probably have their own plan. So then you could end up in a situation where they just launch into retirement and say they're doing it young at 62. Well, if both spouses aren't included on that FEHB and the government spouse happens to pass away, now you've got somebody with no coverage that is, say, 63 years old, and to get private insurance is very, very expensive, to the tune of like $1,200 to $1,500 a month, until they can even qualify for Medicare. So it's in that gap area that you've really got to be careful with those health insurance benefits and make sure you're fully covered.
What are other things, Bruce, from your experiences on planning in general on future expenses that we can learn from?
Well, I think one of them is obviously long-term care. That's hugely expensive, and you've really got to have a plan for that. And another thing is just knowing that we talked about the inflation factors of both healthcare and regular expenses. Unfortunately, under the CSRS system, you had a very strong cost of living adjustment, or a COLA. Well, under FERS, we call it Diet COLA. It does not keep up with inflation. It mathematically cannot. Social Security does a pretty good job of keeping up with inflation, but don't take everything you have as far as resources and try to soak all the income out of it immediately, because that will leave you no growth in your investments to cover that inflation factor down the road. So you've got to keep some powder dry, and also realize that we all know this. Expenses, some of them tend to be lumpy, right? We need to put a new roof on. We need to rebuild the deck. You've got to have some liquidity. I see a lot of federal employees that have everything they have in illiquid investments. So you've got to really understand that you need some contingency money, and you need some inflation coverage. Because, you see a lot of people that put 100% of their TSP into an annuity with no cost of living adjustment. So you really
that's exactly where I was going to go.
Yeah, we see a lot of that.
So what ideally a person is FERS, let's say they're going to take the pension, and they've got a nice amount of money that they built up in the TSP. Are you saying that money should be held in a more or less liquid form for expenses?
Probably not all of it. Some of it you should probably secure. But another thing you got to look at is what Kelly talked about earlier. It's expenses throughout your lifetime that we say quite a bit that it's when you go into retirement, it's the go-go years, the slow go, and then the no-go. A lot of people have a bucket list. They want to travel, they want to get out and do things. So, you'll want a lot of times plan for some big expenses in the first maybe 5 years of retirement while you're out seeing the world. And then, we get to be 75 or 80, that's kind of rocking chair time. We probably don't need as much money other than for the inflation factor to cover basic living expenses. So a lot of times we'll look at it as, okay, the basic living expenses, let's get that as secure as possible. Let's make sure you can eat and keep a roof over your head and a car on the road. And then the rest of it, let's have that more liquid with obviously some more volatility in it, but liquid to where we can reach in and get it whenever we want it.
Is your government pension going to keep up with inflation?
The FERS will not. Well, it depends. It depends on where inflation goes, because
True.
They have a factor. It doesn't exactly match the CPI. Okay, so it lags a little bit, and just a 1 or 2% lag over a 20 or 30 year retirement, that spreads out to where by the time you get out to 20 years from now, you've got a gap of about 10% of what you really need if all you're depending on is the COLA coming from your first pension. So you've got to have some other money that's growing for you that's off to the side so it can fill those gaps.
Okay, we've 4 of the most common mistakes with regard to federal retirement. Number 1 was who is impacted by the government pension offset? What exactly is it? How does it work? Number 2 is failing to properly plan for healthcare costs, rising healthcare costs that will increase for all of us as we age. Number 3, failing to plan for future expenses. Everything is going to cost more. Think 20 years down the road. You want to see how that works? Start Googling the price of common things 20 years ago. A Diet Coke, a set of tires, cable TV, and you'll be shocked. So we know things are going to go up. Number 3, failing to plan for those expenses. Number 4, waiting to plan. Kelly, what does that mean?
Well, what I would say, Keith, is that when we put on workshops for retirement benefits, whether it's for federal employees or the general public at large, the people that attend are ready to retire in 6, 12, 18 months, generally speaking. Now, sometimes you have couples that have a big gap, so you might be in there a little bit earlier with one of the spouses. But the real planning should actually occur much earlier than that. So as Bruce was saying, there's different funds that you can invest in within the TSP while you're working. Well, if you just do a set and forget and you're not planning while you're in your higher income earning years 20 years prior or 15 years before you retire, you really should have a plan of where you're going and a little bit better direction, because you can be really losing out on some good investments during that time frame if you're in the wrong investments. And once you get 12, 18 months out from retirement, it's really too much. You have too little time to make up the gap. You really can't recover at that point or make up the difference by having the wrong funds in place.
Let's stay on that topic for a little while, because think about that. 12, what did you say? 12 to 18 months is not enough time.
It isn't.
And so what is enough time in general?
Well, there's no time that's too early to start planning, really. But having an idea of where you're going from the beginning is always a good idea. Having your plan regularly reviewed is always a good plan. And then taking into account, you talk about 12 to 18 months. Well, what if you were retiring this year in the federal system? At the end of 2019, the highest TSP account stood at nearly 7.4 million. As of March, I believe it was, or April after COVID hit, the highest account was 6.37. So those TSP accounts took a big hit. Well, do you want that being in your last 12 months? What happens if it's in your last 12 months? Now you don't have time to recover. So planning in advance, planning for unforeseen circumstances like we've had, making sure you're participating in the right funds so that you've got something going on in good times and bad is critical.
Bruce.
So really, sorry,
I'm sorry, Kelly. Go ahead. Finish,
I was
please.
going to say, so there really is no time that's too soon to plan.
Bruce, your experience with that and general guidelines with regard to properly or getting the most out of that TSP money.
Well, what I would say is the TSP, like any 401k plan, it's built for growth. It's really not built for secure income. So if you're planning on retiring at 65, you'll want to get in as soon as you can do something constructive with that TSP, which is at age 59 and a half. You can take an in-service withdrawal, and you'll want to talk to an advisor about, hey, can we take a portion of this and get it set up to where we can have secure rising income out of this now, so that we don't have to sweat out those last 4 or 5 years wondering if the market's going to get us there or not. So you do have quite a few options once you get 59 and a half. So I would say that is the latest you should if you're already past it, obviously, then now is the time to start. And when people ask me when's the time to start, that, like Kelly said, they're typically ready now. So we got to work with what we've got. But I strongly urge my clients to have their kids come talk to me, because that's the time to start planning.
I got so lucky. I've had a gentleman come to me in the past few days, over the past couple of weeks, actually, from your book, Bruce.
Oh, good.
He picked it up. He's in Omaha, Nebraska, and he bought your book. And he said, I want to talk to this firm. I want to talk to these people. And a gentleman is 57 years old. For me, as an advisor, that's a gift.
Yeah.
As opposed to being 67 years old and already retired, or 67 years old and I'm going to retire in 6 months.
Right.
Because we can build a foundation. We can just start to move in the direction of where he wants to be.
Right.
Yeah, it's so wonderful, and think of the difference that it makes. You look at life expectancy, and if you're healthy and 65 years old, I believe you've got another at least 20 years to live. If you just look at normal life expectancy.
My minimum planning horizon for a couple at 65 is age 90. Because there's at least a 50% chance that one of you will make it to 90. If you're a male, unfortunately, your life expectancy is about 83, female is about 86. But when you combine those two joint life expectancies, then there's a better chance that one of you will live long. That's the way the actuarial numbers work out. So exactly. Shooting for age 90. I actually stress tested up to age 100 just to make sure. But yeah, we can spend a lot of time in retirement.
And I'll point out there too, in Colorado, we are one of the healthiest states out there. So we have a little bit longer life expectancy.
We're actually at about age 92.
Yeah.
I would say, would you rather outlive your money or have your money outlive you? And I think the answer is obvious. I'd rather have my money outlive me.
That reminds me of a thing that a cowboy friend used to say to me. He says, I'd rather live a fast 40 than a slow 80. So it kind of depends what your lifestyle is, I guess.
So question. Then there are things in any responsible retirement income plan, FERS or not. It needs to expect the unexpected. And I always say the unexpected is that you have a couple. They retire. They have their ducks in a row. And one of them decides to run out to pick up a 6-pack of Diet Coke or something like that at night. And they never make it home. And it was nothing that they could have done anything about. It wasn't their fault. They didn't anticipate it. So then you have the other spouse that's left to enjoy another 20 years of life. So my question to either one of you is, under the federal system, Do spousal benefits get more or less complicated?
I would say I'm sorry.
Okay.
Crazy phone went off.
They do.
Anybody? That actually in the FERS, they're a little bit less complicated.
Really?
Because you've got a choice. Your spousal benefits either 50% of yours or 25% or nothing. Mm-hmm. Or in the old CSRS system, you could kind of pick a number anywhere kind of in between. A 50% spousal benefit typically isn't going to cut it because when one spouse passes, let's say it's the government employee, so the most you're going to get is half of that pension, and you're going to lose one Social Security benefit. So you've certainly got to have some money off to the side or some life insurance that's going to take care of that. And unfortunately, the life insurance that you have as an employee, as a federal employee, unless your health is very poor when you retire, you should probably drop it. Because if you lived a normal life expectancy, you will have paid more into it than what you could get out of it at life expectancy. So there's better insurance plans out there for that. And it's really, again, just setting aside some money that's available for contingencies. And a lot of times what that kind of blends into is, okay, how much do we want to spend down to our last dollar to where the check to the funeral home on the second death bounces?
That's not going to work.
Or do we want to leave some for the kids? And typically people do. And I typically use that money and say, okay, that's our contingency plan. We want it to go to the kids, but if something bad happens to one of the other of us, the kids are going to have to be on their own because we're going to take care of you before we take care of the kids. So,
and Kelly, I was just going to say, and Kelly, that goes to something you said earlier, plan early. Because these are the kind of things with an advisor that you trust, you can sit down and have a conversation about and be made aware of things that you wouldn't have realized otherwise. And you can put this stuff in a row.
Well, and some of those items like long-term care insurance and life insurance, for example, if those are a good fit for your plan, are tremendously more expensive and sometimes just flat out unaffordable as you get towards retirement. So the time to be looking at those things is 30s, 40s, not 50s, 60s.
Right. Good point. Let's transition to the new normal. Does anybody know what that's going to be?
No.
A lot of people have some pretty good guesses.
This is a year like no other.
It is. And it's ingrained, it's affecting all of our lives, it's affecting all of our futures. And we know there will be a new normal. We know that some industries will thrive, other industries will disappear. We know that some habits will thrive, some other habits will totally disappear. We are in for dramatic change. And when there is change, there is opportunity. When there's change, there can also be hardship. We do know some things about COVID and how it's going to affect the federal retirement system. And let's focus on those things for just a few minutes. Bruce, you say there are going to be effects in IRA withdrawal rules. We know that, and the TSP, correct?
Right. First, as far as IRA withdrawals is if you need to take money out of an IRA or a retirement plan, the 10% penalty is waived. Okay, so that's a nice thing, right? The caveat there is that you have to have a valid COVID reason for doing that. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, you're going to pay that 10% early withdrawal penalty. Okay, and that also is kind of a nice little thing that if you are affected, it's limited to a withdrawal of 100,000. So you can pull 100,000 out, penalty free. And if you never put it back, then you have to pay the taxes on the withdrawal, just like you would any other IRA withdrawal. But you've got 3 years to get it back in. Okay, and if you get it all back in, no taxes. So basically, you can basically borrow money from an IRA or a retirement plan. So that's good to have. But again, you have to have a valid COVID reason to do that. And of course, that's not a simple thing to figure out. And you mentioned that they could go and request a a copy of what we built this webinar on, a document that we have. It's got a link to the IRS's frequently asked questions about COVID that'll tell you what those issues are. Second thing that's big this year is that IRA required minimum distributions are suspended. Okay, so you don't have to take out, if you're in retirement and all of a sudden COVID hits and you're not going to take that cruise and you really don't need the money out of that retirement plan, then you can suspend your required minimum distribution. And if you've already taken part of your RMD, you can put it back in. Okay, so that's a nice little thing. And I've probably had, I don't know how many of my clients have said, we can't do anything. We don't need this money. Let's just suspend it. And that also, the markets have recovered fairly well, but this allows more money in there to build back up. If you don't need it, don't take it, because whether you need it or not, you're paying taxes on it.
Yeah.
So if you can get by without the RMD, especially, we all get a stimulus check, hopefully,
Yeah.
Didn't lose it in the mail somewhere, but that will get, that kind of helps bridge the gap a little bit. There may be another one coming, and if you don't know, the nice thing is they're being fairly flexible. You could go ahead and continue to pull it out. And if your bank balance builds up and you don't get bored and decide you need to remodel your kitchen or something while you can't do anything else, towards the end of the year, you can put it back in and then not have to worry about any tax consequences. So, and the suspension of the RMD, you do not have to have a valid COVID reason to do it.
Correct.
That is open to anybody.
And the list is, as I'm aware of it, is very broad, as to having a reason.
Yeah, and it doesn't just have to be you. It can be that a family member has been affected, like
exactly,
and kids moving back into the basement. If you're now having to help support kids that were affected, that's a valid COVID reason. And you don't have to itemize it down to the dollar, is my understanding. They really haven't issued final rules on it, but just that you can say, hey, yeah, I was affected by this. Even if you're still working, maybe your spouse was laid off or had a in an hour. So just make sure you look, because don't get a surprise to where you go to do your taxes and it's like, yeah, I don't have one of these reasons. I think I'm up the creek, because then you're going to pay that 10% penalty along with the taxes, and you won't have the opportunity to put it back.
And once again, here at the end, I'm going to give you that information, how you can get a printed copy of this presentation. And as Bruce said, the link to get that information on those reasons is in that printed copy. So at the end, I'll tell you how to do that once again. Kelly, language that many people who are federal employees will understand. COVID forced changes to use it or lose it and leave carry forward.
Right. So generally speaking, the Office of Personnel Management, or OPM, caps the amount of time that an employee can carry over from one year to the next. And basically what they did is they've issued a exception for some employees to restore their use it or lose it time taken during the pandemic.
And that's for, I'm sorry, Kelly, are we talking vacation and sick pay?
Yes.
Okay.
So while the specifics on how much time they will allow or who it will impact has not been finalized yet, I am keeping a close eye on any postings from the federal government benefits area. So basically they say it'll exercise an exception in the traditional requirements due to it being a national emergency, and they are also going to streamline the process for those who would be impacted and forced to forfeit additional leave.
Very interesting. Either one of you guys or both of you guys, is the federal retirement system healthier or less healthy than Social Security?
I guess it kind of depends on the way you look at it, because the Social Security, as you know, does have a trust fund. So money goes into the trust fund, benefits get paid out, and for the past, 20 years, there's been more money coming into it than has been going out. That's about to change. That's about to tip over to where that trust fund will be depleted. And then unless something legislatively is done, then you're only going to receive about 78% of your benefits starting in about 2032, 2033, 34. It's a moving target. And obviously it's getting worse because so many people are unemployed, so they're not paying into that trust fund. So when we get the trustees report after this year, it's going to look pretty ugly. So that means that you're going to, unless they make changes to the law, then you're going to see about a 22% reduction in your benefit. Now, the federal employment system, that really doesn't have a trust fund. That's just paid out of the general fund. So as long as the federal government can keep writing checks, and you should continue to receive your federal pension. The problem is they can change that at any time they want to. Congress can change it. Nothing is guaranteed. So that's one more reason to have contingency money set aside, because they may get to the point, say, this deficit is just too darn big. We're going to have to do something to do it. And typically when they try to do budget reduction, typically they do try to play fair, where they touch all sectors all the way across the economy. And that obviously includes retirees. So, I'm hopeful you'll never see a reduction, but it certainly isn't guaranteed.
Kelly, your thoughts about both these systems, and for people watching this webcast now, will they both serve them for the rest of their time here on Earth?
I believe that people that are retiring right now are fairly safe. Now, down the road, I don't know. We see legislative changes offered all the time. Now, one of the things I would say, as Bruce alluded to earlier, the cost of living increases, or the COLA for Social Security, has been more in alignment with actual inflation than the FERS program. So that said, that does impact their overall retirement plan with federal government. But do I believe they're okay for now? Yes, but anything could happen. And this year's been an interesting time for all of us. So we've seen things happen that we never thought would happen, and certainly we have to be planned for the unexpected. That's the key.
Just another question. We might as well stay on COVID for one more question. And I want to ask each of you the most important thing to take from all of this, if you just take one thing. But first, let's not ignore what the federal government has done in response to COVID and the additional trillions of dollars of debt that it has gone into in an effort to stimulate the economy, in an effort, the Fed's effort to keep the economy, to keep liquidity alive and moving. That's keep money moving in the economy. That is the Fed's main reason for living. And in order to do that, we have incurred additional trillions of dollars of debt. And as Bruce said earlier, Bruce, you said we might be going around all over again. The debate will be next week in the House as to whether the PPP plan is extended into August or for the rest of the year. And a lot of people see these trillions of dollars being created by the federal government and say, man, that's big trouble down the road.
There's one thing that a little bit of a silver lining to all that debt is the fact that it's like your mortgage. Back when we used to pay 6.5%, 7% interest on our mortgage, a $200,000 mortgage, that was a little tough. Well, now a 30-year mortgage is at 2 3/4. That's a little easier to stand. And one thing the Treasury Secretary has done during this time, which no previous secretary did, and it always just baffled me that they didn't, is he's extended maturities on the debt. It used to be well over half of the federal debt was maturing in 5 years. So you're constantly having to roll that over at whatever the current interest rates are. Well, he's extended out those maturities to where he's got that debt at very low interest rates. Okay, so typically the historically, I don't know if you can even look at history under the current economic conditions, but the 10-year Treasury used to run about 4.5%. Okay, so if the federal government wanted to borrow something for 10 years, wanted to borrow money for 10 years, they paid 4.5%. Right now, they're paying 0.66%.
Yes.
So even though conceivably we could see almost a doubling of debt, you could see lower interest payments on that debt going forward. So I think we can stand a little bit more debt. I don't like it. I don't ever like debt. I don't like the fact that in good times we run deficits and in bad times we run deficits. Huge deficits in bad times, just kind of run-of-the-mill deficits in good times. So I think everybody knows the federal government has a spending problem that we'd like to see addressed. Even, and my federal employees, they say the same thing to me. They say, yeah, there's just a lot of stuff that is going on that hopefully we can get under control because it is troubling. But by extending that debt out, that gets us kind of by the next 10, 15 years. But then where are interest rates going to be when that debt comes due? We could be back in the 70s at 18% Treasury rates.
Ouch.
And then we'd really, really be in trouble.
Kelly, what do you say to clients who are worried about this?
I try to calm and keep people's emotions out of any of the planning process as best I can, because it's often the knee-jerk reactions where people panic, where the mistakes are made. So I think the best thing we can do is, not tell people just to sit and wait without any plan in place, but to have realistic expectations of what you can control right now and what you can't control, and have a backup plan for those items that you can't control. I am seeing a lot of people looking for other careers and perhaps looking at other ways to make sure they've got their own personal financial houses in order to withstand another wave of quarantine. So that's a good thing. And I'm also seeing more people kind of come together and reevaluate. I have to tell you, I pretty much like what I'm spending on gas right now. And I think I filled up my tank 3 times since March. So
my friends working in the oil field don't like what you're paying.
That's true.
That's
so
true.
there's two sides to everything.
That is. And, I'll be one of those females that says I usually get my hair done a lot more frequently, and I've saved quite a bit. So there's budget considerations on the consumer level where we can kind of look and say, okay, well, maybe I can go 6 weeks without having my hair colored.
You don't color your hair. No way.
No, this is natural.
I love it. Let's wrap up with the single. If we could only take one thing from this conversation, the most valuable thing, in your opinion, what would that be? Bruce, then Kelly.
What I see with a lot of federal employees is that they, in a way, put planning a little bit backwards, because most federal employees are on a more, I'd call it a stable career track than private sector employees. They're, federal employment certainly isn't guaranteed, but if you're doing a good job and, there aren't a bunch of budget cuts, you're typically fairly secure in your position. So you can project out, okay, here's what my FERS annuity is going to be. Here's what Social Security is. Those are 2 givens. And then I look at my TSP statement and it says I can get this much out of it a year when I retire. Well, that's a problem, because then people say, okay, so that's what my budget should be when I retire. Well, that TSP pension, what that is based on is a single life annuity. So no spousal protection and no cost of living adjustments. So rather than say, okay, this is how much I have to live on, and I'll just plan on spending that every year, let's really dig down into your lifestyle, as Kelly mentioned, figure out, are we going to have lumpy expenses early on? We're going to cruise the world, and then things will back off. And let's really try to align your spending with your lifestyle, rather than just say, here's what I got, I'll spend it all. Because if you take that route, you will run into issues later on down the road because of the lack of inflation protection.
You'll run out of you'll run out of money before you run out of life.
Well, you'll still have money coming in. It just won't be enough.
Yes, and that's none of us want that.
Right.
You've worked too hard for that. Kelly, most important thing to take from this, if we could only take one thing.
Sure. I would say plan early and get a second opinion. For those people who have a plan or have had somebody give them advice on what they may or may not want to do in the future, a second opinion. You wouldn't go to a surgeon and only have one opinion for something that major. Retirement and what money we're going to have to spend and how we're going to spend it in the future is one of the biggest things we try to plan for, but one of the things we get the least advice on. So we want to make sure that we get a second opinion and we get a second look early, not.
Yeah.
So I would say there is no time that's too soon. Today is it. So if you don't have a plan, or you have a plan that needs to be looked at by a second set of eyes, needs an advisor.
I'll use a phrase that a young coworker used, gifted me way back in time, and that is, don't ignore it until it becomes a problem. Instead, stay ahead of the curve. And this is one that you'll be far better off, and those you love will be far better off if you stay ahead of this curve and not ignore it until it becomes a problem.
Absolutely.
Bruce, Kelly, it has been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you, Keith.
Yeah,
Thank
thanks.
you.
Anytime that we can join you, we're always here.
We love it. We love it. We are always here. And we invite you to go to presidentialwm.com, click on contact, and ask us to email you the printed version of this webcast. We'll do it. Ask for the 4 mistakes to avoid and COVID-19's impact on federal retirement. Also, send us topics that you would like us to address on the Eagle's Nest webcasts. For Bruce Larsen and Kelly St. George, I'm Keith Weinman from Presidential Wealth Management. And never hesitate to call us with your questions. We're at 303-694-1600.
Thank you, Keith.
Presidential Wealth Management securities and investment advisory services are offered through Forta Financial Group, Inc., a registered broker-dealer, member FINRA and SIPC.